Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us here on a Monday as we continue through the book of Ruth. Grateful that you would join us. We are starting the second chapter, and I would say, Michael, really with the second chapter, things take a turn in this book. We start to go some new directions. Just a quick recap. Naomi, an Israelite, has lost husband, both sons. One of her daughter-in-laws stayed in the land of Moab where they were and where she was from, Orpah. And the daughter-in-law, Ruth, for whom the book is named, has followed Naomi. They have returned to Bethlehem, but they are in a difficult and semi-dangerous situation in that they are both widows, they are both women, and they evidently at this point don't have much in the way of family, though there is a connection we'll see today. And what do we make of this turn? Let me do some reading, and then we'll come back and we can begin to have some conversation. So I'll go through maybe 7 verses here. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Amalek, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So Ruth went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was one of the family of Elimelech. But just then Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to the servant who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she's been out on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment. Well, maybe pause there for a minute. So a couple of things culturally that might help here. There is, if you go into the Old Testament laws, there is a provision made for those who don't have anything, for those who are poor, for those who are needy, that they can go work fields. And so there are restrictions on how farming is done. Leave the edges of your field. Don't go a second time. When you harvest, don't go over it a second time. And the idea is that there would be enough in the field for those who are willing to go out and to gather and to sort of provide for themselves a subsistence diet. And so Ruth makes this offer to Naomi that she will go, and remember we were told it was during the barley harvest, that she would go and she would walk behind the reapers and she would gather. And so this is what she does, and then coincidentally Boaz happens to see her there, inquires about her. And the last thing we're told here, which is very interesting, Michael, is that she has not rested. So we get the idea that Ruth is, that she is resilient, that she's a worker, that she's not begging, that she is willing to put in the time and effort to help her situation and to help Naomi as well.
Yeah, so I think we do start in a fitting place if we want to talk about Ruth's character, because I think you're exactly right, Clint. We are learning something about Ruth. We've already learned that she's faithful and loyal. We've already talked about how these words that she offers are a beautiful expression of human fidelity to one another in just the previous chapter. And now, as we turn our attention to chapter 2, we're going to learn something else about Ruth. She's not only faithful, she's not only committed to her mother-in-law to go with her, to leave her land, to leave her family, to leave all of the security that she might have had there, to go with Naomi, to come to Bethlehem, and then to figure it out. And part of her solution to figuring out is clearly in the story working hard, to do her part, to follow the rules, by the way, to follow the cultural expectations laid out for those who don't have much, if anything at all. And she's going to do her part. And that is certainly an expression of the kind of woman that she is. And that is certainly laudable in the way that we see both her and Naomi doing what it takes for them to survive. And Clint, we've said this numerous times, but it's just worth noting, this is a very positive portrayal of women and their ability to make ends meet in a situation in which they are indeed, as we've said numerous times before in the study, that they are at risk, that they certainly bear each and every day some level of insecurity because of the situation they find themselves in. Yet we discover that these women are resilient, that they have an ability to engage these problems, and they are doing so in a really laudable way. I think what's fascinating is, as it turns into chapter 2, there's so many details. Some of those are on the front end of the text. We can see them easily in our translations. Before the end of the study here, there are some other things that are behind the text that are maybe not so well reflected in the translation, Clint. But one thing I think is interesting is you have some of the least prominent, least notable people now coming in contact with, as the text says it, a prominent rich man, Boaz. This field is, of course, owned by a family member or a kinsman, but there's also a sense in which here those who are on the bottom of the scale are now engaging with that one of those who are at the top. There's a kind of opposites meeting in this moment. There's a privilege meeting a poverty. There's someone with agency and strength meeting those who don't have it. And chapter 2 is turning into a new leaf, because all of that loss, all of that we need to give up, these things that we had in Moab, that's now going to transition now that they've come into this new chapter, new land, back to Bethlehem. Boaz introduces a radical transformation and change in the tone of the text.
Yeah, I think so. And it's kind of a difficult decision when to get into that part of the storyline. But maybe just to tell you that what is going to develop here is primarily now this relationship between Ruth and Boaz. These two characters who haven't quite intersected yet, but are at least in Boaz's case aware of Ruth. This is going to be kind of the primary line of the story now. Naomi is still in the tale, and she will still provide some advice. But this story now kind of turns with a semi-romantic, semi-gracious, semi-paternal, and I mean that in the sense that Boaz is going to want to protect Ruth and kind of help her, and we're going to see him being very gracious to her. And I suppose there's a mixed review on that. For some, maybe the idea of a man swooping into these stories and kind of providing a way out or playing the role of deliverer is not appealing. But again, I think you can read this both ways. I think you can ultimately read this story and say that Boaz has been generous and gracious. Certainly he's interested in Ruth, and Ruth has been hardworking and courageous and faithful. I don't necessarily feel, Michael, that you have to choose one of those storylines. I actually think the book does a pretty nice job of weaving them together. And I think, the danger is we come with one agenda or the other, and maybe we miss the other side of the tale. But I think you can hold those things together pretty well.
So I think that there's an element here that helps us to see those tensions that you're talking about, Clint, because one of our temptations in reading a story might be to look for the most simple explanation and then to just hang on to it. But I think the writer of this book is intending to show us how opposites, when they come together, can create some really interesting tensions. And one of the things that we have here in these first verses of chapter 2 is there's already beginning in the original language to be some plays on words. And in the Hebrew, the word is yada, which means to know. And I don't think we have this very cleanly in the English translations, Clint, but here at the beginning, a lot of these relations, like the word kinsman, actually means, it comes from the word yada, to know, and there's some markings in the Masoretic that we don't need to get into the weeds. The whole point being, there's the idea of Boaz is known to Naomi, though Ruth is unaware or unknown. Boaz is unknown to Ruth, but then at some point in this, just these few verses, Boaz comes to know of Ruth, and there's all of this playing back and forth on just this sheer idea of knowing, of who's known and who's unknown, and that kind of tension is going to happen in multiple different dimensions, not just today, but actually as the story progresses through future verses and even chapters. The reason I'm bringing this up is to say this. Of course, the language stuff is interesting on its own, but I think one of the things, Clint, it helps us to see is that the author intends for us to recognize that though these things may stand on opposites, maybe Boaz and Ruth represent very opposite ends of the spectrum. One is male and Israelite, the other is female and Moabite. The reality is, when they come together, there's this interesting kind of combination and sorting and processing, and there's a way in which those strands never absorb the other, and yet they still can live in tension, or at some point you might even say harmony with one another. And I think that that's kind of the amazing thing being done here, is it's portraying this at a personal level. Some scholars are going to tell us that part of the functions of Ruth is actually to tell a larger national story, to talk about how Israel and these other nations, especially as you start looking at kingly lines and these kinds of things, that we can understand how they might be able to move ahead together. And whether that's true or not is unimportant for this section of the story. It's just to say, I think that the tensions are on purpose, Clint, and I think they're held together in really interesting and important ways.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think we see here the plantings of the major part of the story now. And notice again that Ruth is not called Ruth. When Boaz asks the question, he's told she is the Moabite. Again, she's not named here. She is the outsider. And this is going to be the story, in some ways, one of the ultimate Bible stories of outsider becoming insider. And even in ways that will flow into the New Testament and the lineage of Jesus. And so we continue to see that transition of someone who is held at arm's length now coming further and further into the circle. So the beginnings here of what's going to be a major plot line, and I think probably we will see a lot more of that tomorrow. We'll try to cover a significant chunk tomorrow so that we can follow that as it grows.
Friends, we are certainly glad to have you with us on a study like this. I think as we transition into the second chapter, we begin to see this book to really get legs and to really pick up. And so certainly hope that you will commit to join us for the length of that study. The best way to do that would be to subscribe. You'll find that in the description of the button right underneath the video here. We'd love to have you comment if you have questions or thoughts. And of course, we would love to see you as we continue the study tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.